way of introduction, everybody, I'm Ashley Green Thompson, and I'm based in Johannesburg. I'm the director of Act Ubumbano, which is really a space, a resource for those who are involved in social justice work, wherever they might be. We don't define ourselves by the thematic issues often that define NGOs. So we do that because we don't believe that the struggles of communities are defined by thematic issues. People live their lives and they fight against the indignities visited on them by a system that doesn't favor those who are marginal. So when people resist that dehumanization, they don't do it today under the theme of gender justice and then tomorrow under economic justice. They just defend their dignity wherever they are. So I'm hoping that this conversation will explore what that means and how we can stand together with those communities who are under the hammer. I'm not sure what else I can say by word of welcome. We had about 107 people sign up for the event. I'm hoping that we get close to that number. I know that there's always a few latecomers, people who trying to grab their last cup of coffee or whose meetings overran. So hopefully we'll get up to that. I think that we've got about 30 something now in the room. And they're coming from all over the region. So clearly this is an issue that resonates with activists and community workers throughout the region. We've got a few people coming out of the UK. I think we've got somebody registered from Spain. And we hope that they will all contribute to a fruitful discussion. Your moderator is Alan Moorman. He's a long-standing collaborator of Act Ubumbano. He often facilitates our discussions. Don't be upset when he asks hard questions and gets controversial. We don't take the safe route. Act Ubumbano is a space that tries to ask the hard questions. We use a methodology called See, Judge, Act in our critical reflective processes. It forces you to ask difficult questions. We are not interested in run-of-the-mill standard responses to social problems. We are trying to get deep into the things that prevent us from achieving the justice, the social justice objectives that we want. With respect, you are welcome to ask your questions as controversial and as difficult as they may be. You're allowed to make your opinions very clear, and we'll engage. We'll go there to those places that others might consider a little bit uncomfortable. But we hope that we emerge from this conversation with some ideas, some practical ways in which we can stand in solidarity in a meaningful way with those who are under threat throughout the region. And of course, I have to do the plug. You have to go and check out the website because we do a lot of work. I wouldn't be earning my salary if I didn't plug actubumbano.org. So please go and check it out and subscribe to our newsletter. You probably do already because that's why you're on this call. But spread the word. Ellen, is that okay by way of an introduction?
Thanks. Thank you, Ashley. I think it sets the tone for the meeting. Just to say to people, I'm going to try to keep the session quite conversational. I'm going to make a brief input to set the scene for us, what the conversation is about and where we're trying to get to. We'll then ask Kia and Zagiti to introduce themselves and talk a little bit about their own work and their own passions. And then we'll start a conversation with them around some of the things that are happening in communities. And then we'll sort of segue into a more open community dialogue. You're more than welcome to type questions into the Q&A box. You're also welcome to use the chat box. And if you want to speak, please raise a hand. For some of the questions, I might ask you to actually put your mic on and speak to the room. If I don't quite understand the question, if I think that there needs to be some clarity for the rest of the group to have. Other than that, we would really like to keep this as a sort of a large community conversation. So please feel free to engage with the content and share your experience. And I think in particular, we're going to be driving towards very practical recommendations for those of us that are in the room, but also people who possibly can't attend this event as well. So yeah, so that's the tone for the meeting. So to kick off, violence is becoming quite normalized for many of us in Southern Africa in particular. And we are like the frogs in the slowly warming water, where violence has become such an everyday part of our lives that we very rarely respond to it anymore. It's only in its extremities that we seem to be able to mount any kind of response. And this is not just a phenomenon here, but all over the world, we are seeing a marked increase in attacks on social justice leaders and whistleblowers. And I'm very deliberately using the term social justice leaders because it goes beyond the people who are caught sort of in the visible spotlights of violence, the famous people or those who lead and stand on platforms, but ordinary people engaged in the business of trying to access justice are increasingly facing attack. And this is across sectors. In South Africa, we've seen deaths in the environmental sector, people working in land and housing, in the extractive sector. Violence is a sort of permanent feature of working in the gender community. And increasingly, we're seeing attacks on the LGBTQI community as well. And I probably miss out on a whole lot of those names and faces and sectors by focusing on those. But I think violence is a phenomenon that we have to start engaging with more directly, particularly given the context that we live in. But the violence is not just physical. Violence is also being sort of waged against people through things like slap suits and malicious litigation. We've seen attacks on for instance, the Center for Environmental Rights in the last few years, where people have been sued in their personal capacity. We've seen instances where activists are being publicly identified as the source of the problems that communities face. And those actors are sometimes state actors. I mean, we saw last week in Parliament a direct question to organizations who were campaigning around reforms to the Electoral Act, being told that they were agents of regime change by a senior political figure. But also we've seen instances where corporates have named particular individuals in public media and named them as the source of community problems, which has led to sort of large-scale social sanction, which has led to threats and intimidation being waged against people's families in communities. And I suppose the biggest thing about all of this, and probably the one that we don't often, well, maybe not don't often talk about, but one that was in the news recently, was a direct attack on an organization called the Socioeconomic Rights Institute, where they were named and were threatened during the xenophobic violence that we saw in this country, to the point where the organization had to actually close its doors for a few days to protect its staff. So violence is everywhere, but the biggest concern, I think, from my perspective and from many of us, is that these attacks are resulting in intra-community conflict. So the people themselves are starting to mistrust each other, to attack each other, and erode all of the gains that we've made in terms of building solidarity and cohesion against injustice. And beyond this also, we're seeing an increase in state surveillance. There's potentially extremely restrictive laws that are being proposed under the guise of anti-terrorism and money laundering in South Africa and in other parts of the region as well. Zimbabwe is facing a particularly pernicious NGO bill. And so the environment for activists and activism is really, really shrinking and closing. And then we spend a lot of time talking. We spend a lot of time talking to each other about human rights defense work and protecting people. And we talk and we talk and we want to use the instruments of the law, but the instruments of the law only have a certain efficacy. And beyond that, most activists still have to come back into an environment of threat. If you follow the Bain saga, a whistleblower by the name of Athol Williams has actually had to flee the country and live in near exile because of the threat against his life in South Africa. And over the last few days has been tweeting sort of almost on a constant basis, asking the Human Rights Defense Committee, or the sector, what is being done to help them secure their own lives and livelihoods, because it's been completely eroded. And so the results of these actions are complex and they have real impacts on real people's lives. So our conversation today is really to ask where to next, right? How do we build systems of support and defense that don't rely on external saviors? How do we create the conditions in our community where the work of accountability and participation is accepted and the people who engage in those processes of accountability are not threatened, are not having to flee, and can live in relative safety and comfort within their own spaces of community. So our conversation today wants to focus on what do we do as community members to try to create an environment in which we can actually live out our public life and hold others to account. I also just want to put the rider in that that's not to say that the work around legal reform and policy and protections must stop. I think what we are asking for is that we invest in systems in parallel to the legal and policy work that's happening, because those are as necessary, if not more necessary, for the safety of activists in community. So that's my little spiel for the morning. I'm going to try to be a lot more quiet over the course of the conversation. And I'm going to ask our panelists to introduce themselves, because I would probably not be able to do justice to their lives and experience. So as an introduction, I'd like to ask Kia and Zagiti to introduce themselves, talk a little bit about their work, and more importantly, what drives your activism? What makes you do the work that you do? Shall we do this in alphabetical order this time? Shall we go Kia and then Zagiti?
Okay, it's actually extremely unfortunate, Alan, because usually I'm the person that's last on the list. So Zagiti, you're lucky. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for this opportunity to engage and be able to be in conversation. I am a social justice activist, a popular educator, and one of the co-founders of the Thought Collective, which is a Pan-African feminist and knowledge production research hub for activists in the Global South. And yeah, that's my short story in terms of who I am. And I think in terms of your question, Ellen, what gives expression to my activism is the work that I do with those who are at the front lines of the issues that they're facing, and building and deconstructing with them and grappling with in terms of what is the issues, what can we do, and what we can collectively do to move forward in terms of that. Thanks.
Thank you, Kia. Zagiti? Yeah. Oh, there we go.
Oh, sorry. Thank you so much, Ellen. My name is Zagiti Spanzi from the Swaziland Rural Women's Assembly. I'm the programs officer. Swaziland Rural Women's Assembly is an organization for rural women which deals with climate change, women's rights, women and girls' rights, and also for gender-based violence, so that the sole mission for the organization is to see a just society that respects women and girls, and also challenges the climate change. So what drives me to activism is that I think it's because I was raised by an ex-mine worker, and we would remain home with my mom, and seeing her struggling with us, raising us, with our father living very far. I think it's what drives me. And also further, when I grew up and I had to go to tertiary, I had no scholarship. I saw the struggles that the whole youth is facing in the country, and also what women go under on daily basis, the patriarchy that is entrenched by the system in Swaziland. That is what drove me to activism.
Thank you. Thank you, Zagiti. So to open the conversation, I'd like to invite both of you to maybe just take some time and describe some of the conditions that communities are facing at the moment in relation to this idea of closing civil society space, but also in terms of the violence people are confronting on a day-to-day basis.
Kitty, you can go first.
I think currently what is happening in communities is that really the civic space is closing. Take for instance in Swaziland, where besides that it's a patriarchal society which we have been living in for a long time, but also it's an absolute monarch where the king holds all the powers, the legislation, the judiciary, and he's also above the constitution, which makes it difficult for us as activists to go to communities and educate people on their right, because a right in Swaziland is criminalized. Like when you are talking about rights, it feels like now you want to overthrow the king. So it is very difficult. And also working at a space in the space of women, where it is not just the whole system, but also in their families, where the patriarchy goes to their husbands. They will not allow themselves to go to meetings, or whenever they want to hold leadership positions, they need to ask from their husbands. That is what caused the space for women to become even more harsh. And women are very vulnerable at that process. And also the issue of violence that is entrenched during the political unrest, which also causes women to back off even more, because they are afraid to take lead positions, because the whole nation have now become violent. Each and every day we are facing attacks. The problem is that the people even themselves are resilient to the attacks that were caused by the regime, where police will just kill people, will raid homes and beat people, detain people. So it has become so harsh that there's an image group that is defending activists, but also it is making more damage, because the regime is also pulling hard to activists, which might not be even part of the groups that are maybe banning structures, but activists are being targeted. So it becomes very difficult for us activists to come out and continue pushing the struggles because you might be targeted. Just to share a practical example that happened during this week, and an activist was, it is assumed that it's police officers who came and they started shooting at everything. The windows were broken, a glass door was broken. Fortunately, there wasn't any fatalities because they were able to hide and do not make any noise so that they are not heard where they are, because they would be shot. And I think there will be evidence that that thing that fall when you are shooting, I've forgotten the name. It is evidence that it's from the state. So that is why we assume it is the state that was shooting, and they also bent down his car, the activist car, and during this week also a former president of a party in Swaziland, his home was burnt down. Mind you, that president is late now. The former president is late. So the state is all out to deter activists. So that is how harsh the space it is in Swaziland, and even trouble for women who are activists. Thank you.
Thank you, Zagiti. Kia?
Thanks. And then at the point that Zakiti sort of rounded off with, for me, it's particularly important because I think the conversations around, the shrinking space of dissent have been taking place in different iterations in the past, 4 years or so in our lived memories. But I think it's interesting to kind of look at how it's manifesting differently for different kinds of social justice activists. And the manifestations in relation to the violence is different, and I guess the stakes are higher for different people. I think for me, what's been, for me, a particular, I guess, big moment was the Marikana massacre and how it transformed how organizing, movement building, and even resistance can look like in communities affected by extractivism and in communities who are fighting to protect environmental justice rights. And for me, kind of what I've seen is that the introduction of big guns into community spaces has kind of demobilized and destabilized the opportunities of how social justice activists and organizers used to sometimes be seen as, the backbone and pillar of the community or the space in which they're operating in. And because of the huge amounts of violence that has been introduced into activism, and I mean, it's not the first time, it's just the way that we're seeing it, it makes it a tricky thing, right? So now if I am a social justice activist, I don't want to say it out loud. If I am an organizer, I don't want people to know that I am an organizer and what am I organizing for. And what you're referring to, Ellen, around the intra-community challenges, I mean, we've seen a huge rise in that, right? If I then say I am a social justice activist, even my own community members and those who I'm trying to build with would be against me. And that then, it's a snowball effect in terms of we lament how it's difficult for movement to grow and be built in the region. But one of the reasons for that is that there's a fear that comes with being a part of anything that's going to contribute to transformation. And I think what's also been interesting and what we need to locate and understand is that the violence that we're seeing, yes, is not only coming from the state, but the state is being used as a tool to push forth particular things, because we're a part of the global system. So if there's an unrest in a particular area, in a particular country, or with a particular community, it plays a significant role in the global supply chain. It plays a significant role in any form of financial chain. And for me, what's been interesting is that there's, I guess, some duality in relation to how we can say there's a direct linkage, right, with the rise of collective power and the shift of the balance of power, and also the amount of repression and violence that we're seeing. So I think as much as this is an important conversation to have, and we can look at it from, I guess, somewhat of a difficult and negative perspective, it is also important for us to locate the conversation in the sense that there's interesting positives that is an indication that the fight that we're engaging in is an important fight and a robust fight, and we should be engaging in it because the powers that be are responding to our collective power in this particular manner. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Kia. I mean, I think that maybe that's a good point for us to sort of drive into a more open conversation about, so what are the potentials that we're seeing for change? Are there starting points? Are there any interesting things that you've come into contact with that may suggest that we can mount some kind of collective response? And I'd like everybody in the audience to start thinking about their own examples of this, because we're going to go to you once our speakers have had a chance to make inputs. So I think just carry on, Kia, your line of thinking is already there, and then we'll come back to Zagiti.
I think, I mean, as a fresh activist on the block, I draw a lot from, the experience and examples of organizing and mobilizing that have taken place historically in the region and across the world. And I think what was interesting, particularly with the hard restrictions in relation to movement with the COVID-19 pandemic, using South Africa as an example, what we saw was the development of community, action networks or community networks. And I mean, yes, of course, they were coalescing around food security. But these notions of coalescing around a particular issue can also be the beginning of coalescing around community and collective protection. I think we've been moving away from how we've been doing things because the system has been pushing us to think about individualizing things. And even when we maybe draw back on the examples of ward committees and ward councils and such like, where there can be a community or a street group that's protecting each other, letting each other know, I mean, in 2022, in personal and private apartment blocks or even estates, there's always these unfortunate WhatsApp groups where someone is complaining about someone else. But these can be, ideas in which we're sharing information with each other and letting each other know, not telling each other that I saw someone with a hoodie who's of a caramel persuasion, but much more of, hey, those kinds of ideas and things. And I think maybe even going back to establishing civic spaces again. I think a lot of the things that we've been pushed out of, particularly in communities and even in townships, we don't have community halls, we don't have any more sports grounds and areas in which we can coalesce and meet. And if these areas and infrastructures were maintained, either existed or still exist, these can be spaces in which people can look for refuge or come together as a community to think through how they can create protection or just even discuss particular issues that are for that particular community. Because I think one of the other things that is contributing and perpetuating this kind of violence that we're seeing is that people are forced to feeling like they're alone. And the powers that be want you to feel that way. And so if we can go back to creating spaces of collective community communication and conversation, sitting under the tree, and being in conversation, we can start thinking about what works for the community in Woodstock, Thanks.
Cool. Zagiti, and then I'm going to open the floor for comments and inputs from others in the conversation.
Thanks, Ellen. But please, can you assist me with the discussions that we are on now?
So Zagiti, we're asking, are there any positive things? So it's gloomy, right? There's lots of stuff that's happening that makes us really feel terrible about the state of the world. But are there any things that give us hope? Are there any things that people are doing that we could possibly start thinking about building on?
Okay, thank you. Definitely yes, because when you are feeling the heat, it is very difficult for you to sit back and look into upon. For us, I think the youth uprising and defending their rights is what is positive, and the fact that the state have pushed them so hard that they've nothing to lose. They feel like they need to push until there is democracy in Swaziland. And at a women's perspective, as Rural Women's Assembly, we have developed women groups in the communities, and these women groups have seen that it is very helpful for them to keep meeting and talking about these issues, and also lobbying local government, like the traditional leaders, in terms of the land question, which is very paramount with the rural women, or women in particular, because it is where they will grow their food to feed their families. So it is a very positive thing for us that they've seen it is important for them to keep meeting and talk to these issues without maybe even being pushed by the organization, because sometimes you find that an organization tend to float on its own, like the office tend to float on its own without the members being involved. Then I think it was a good investment for Rural Women's Assembly to train organizers who will be part of the communities and will be doing the day-to-day activism on the ground, than having just the office coming and doing maybe education and going. When the office go, then SROA is no longer, or ROA is no longer in the communities. But we invested in the organizers that then became the day-to-day, they became the day-to-day educators in the communities. I think that is what is positive, that even if we will say we do not have enough funds to go to them and visit them, but the little that they got from the organization, they are being able to do impact, or they are doing something effective in the days of other people on day-to-day basis.
Thank you, Zagiti. I'd like to ask colleagues from other parts of the region who are on the call, if you could share your experience of some of the challenges that you're facing, but much like our panelists have also done now, what are some of the positives that you're seeing in your contexts? So if there's somebody possibly from Zimbabwe on the call who would like to speak, if you just raise your hand and we will give you the floor. We have a hand raised. There we go. Juliet, I think you have the mic.
Good morning. Okay, so it's actually an honor to be part of this platform and this conversation. And it's sad actually to listen to all the speakers who have been airing out the challenges that not only activists are facing, but also the humanitarian platforms, players. You know, the platform is really shrinking. And I think it's good that people are now coming together to kind of find a way to discuss and to find how we can continue working. So the social space is not only about activism, it's actually about also a lot of factors. I'm not an activist, I'm actually a humanitarian, and I am a founder of an organization in Zimbabwe. And from Zimbabwe, it's also like that space is also shrinking. So it's how best, because it's not only about the activists coming up and then coming in, because somebody should already be active or be operational in a context, in a community before they start standing up, you understand, for a community. So I support vulnerable children and young people. But when I feel their rights are being affected, I would not just at some point just start from there. So it's kind of like I already work with the community and I am known for supporting, or my work is known for supporting children and young people with a lot of projects. So when something has, it's easy for me to speak up or for people to listen. So there are a lot of dimensions or a lot of discussions that need to happen for us, or some collective approach that activists and social players need to come together to try and address. So these are things like I've heard somebody mentioning something like individualism. So we need to have like a collective effort on how, as players, we can join hands, join forces, and try and fight for the space not to close up, because it is fast closing up. That is that's the honest truth. And mostly it's most of the issues or challenges that have been raised, people are mentioning politics a lot more, but then how do we ensure that this platform that we have does not continue to shrink? And it's not only pertaining to a single country, it's almost like something that is affecting the whole Southern African region, or not only Southern African region, actually globally. You'll be surprised that a lot of countries are actually having these challenges. So as players, how do we come together and start fighting to have to ensure that this space does not continue to shrink and shrink? With, how do we join hands? How do we engage the powers that be to ensure that we also have, or we have the right to talk or to be heard? So probably that would be my contribution. Thank you.
Thank you, Juliet. I'm probably going to come back to you later to ask you how you think we might want to do that. But let's take a few more voices first. So we have Matthews, Mandireva, and Godfrey. I'm not sure the person who's moderating will open mic for you individually. So Matthews. There we go, Matthews. You have the floor, Matthews.
Oh yeah, thank you now. Yeah, sure. Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Thank you so much. Yeah, indeed. I'm Matthews from Malawi. I work with the ACT Alliance Malawi Forum as the national coordinator. Yeah, there are a lot of positives in activism. I'll give my general view about it. In as far as holding, for instance, duty bearers and government accountable, even non-government organizations accountable, I think activism is very key, and it really empowers the grassroots. It is really working, and we've seen it working. And what I see as challenges are that like here in Malawi, sometimes we see that people stand as activists and they start very well, but in the way they fall into temptations, such that sometimes the activists who were existing in the past decades are no longer active now. We have new faces. It's like there are temptations along the way, and I would also like to ask our colleagues who are here, who have presented, how are they able to overcome those temptations? For instance, in the way some activists, they are given, for example, a job by government, who they at the first they were the same people who were tasked to hold the government accountable, but later on you find that they've gotten a bigger job, a bigger position from the government, and then you see them silent, no longer continuing with activism. So such kind of bad evidence in the activism has also made those people who are on the grassroots, the rights holders, to lose trust in the current activists. So it's like some people have been wounded in the way, and we people are thinking that every activist who is coming in the way is doing it for personal benefits, is looking for a position, is looking for incentives from the government, is looking for something which should be done for him, and then when he has achieved that, maybe it's monetary benefit, then she is going to sit down, he's going to sit down. So I think there is also something from our side maybe we should be done to make sure that we retain this trust, we maintain this trust, so that activism is also cleaned. So I'm looking at a shrinking space not only as a cause from our enemy side, or maybe from those people who are working to that they should change, but it is also something that I think from us there is also need for discipline, which has to be maintained, and that discipline will be a very key to make sure that we maintain trust from the people. Because I think for me, as far as the activism has got defense from right holders, it is possible for it to stand. But where activism has lost trust from the last holders, from the right holders, it becomes a very big challenge for you to charge, or maybe to continue performing your duties. So that's really what I wanted to say. Yeah, we have got examples of some activists who have stood their ground and they are still defending the noble cause, but a lot of them have really fallen into the trap, into the temptation. They've been given jobs by government, and some of them we hear they received money and they became silent, they went silent. So it's not only persecutions which are maybe threats, but it is also those incentives which have come in the process, which are also taking away the activists and is also contributing to the shrinking space. Thank you so much. That's my contribution.
Thank you, Matthew. I'm going to ask that people are making inputs, try to be a little bit more concise, please. We don't have a huge amount of time, and we're going to try to get as many voices as we can into the room today. In the meanwhile, while we're getting, I think, Godfrey the mic, could Kia or Zagiti reflect on the notion of the economy and its impact on people's activism? So in an environment where we're all struggling to survive and these incentives to become available, what are some of the things that we need to be thinking about in order to reduce the temptation, as it were? So maybe if you guys could have a quick go at that before we give Godfrey the mic. So Giti, I
They
see.
want to go first?
Yeah.
Okay, thanks, comrade. And then it is a quite tricky one and a very difficult one. I remember how the government then tend to shut people down by last year there was an uprising, and this year all of a sudden there is recruitment in all the security organizations like your prison, right? The same, you're signing up for these jobs, and it is very difficult because we really need to keep living despite the challenges that we are facing. And also, without just that, also as activists, note that who are not going for those jobs but then still need to live, it is very difficult because at times you prefer buying a loaf of bread than taking a bus to a rally or taking a bus for a meeting. So it is very difficult. I think we also need to have some strategies of economic empowerment, which we had tried to do as rural women with the women group, where women would be doing their savings and also doing income generation projects. But during the COVID era, it all crumbled, and because everyone was supposed to be in isolation. So I think now we need to pick up and start afresh and go back to do those income generation projects, so that we are also able to fund the struggling and continue going and continue struggling.
Thank you, Zagiti. Thank you so much. Kia?
This is a very difficult question. I think about it all the time. And I've been thinking a lot even about now what I'm going to say. I think for me, as a way to answer your question is to go about it the other way around, which is to say, I think the problems with activism is that it's become professionalized, it's become a job. So, and because it's become professionalized, that means that it's within the very same economic system that we're wanting to fight to transform. So that means that it has the same tenets of professionalized work that we have issues with. So that would then mean that those who are engaging in professional activism would want to keep it in a particular way. So we will not think about how an activist who's a community-based activist or one who's engaging in frontline work would need financial and economic support. It's not some selfless altruistic thing that I'm doing, because there's a reason why I'm engaging in this, and it is then the responsibility of the professionalized activist to actually make sure, how do we continue to sustain and support those who are not engaging in activism because it's a way to be professional. I think another way to look at it is that the issues that we have in relation to activists who end up becoming office bearers or go to the other side, and we don't understand, how could they betray it? They're playing a game, like we all are playing a game. Capitalism, neoliberalism, and the economic system is a game. So if we don't answer the real life question on how do I eat and put food on the table and still wage a war to transform society, we will always have folks who then decide that in order to eat, I need to make a particular decision. So what I'm saying is that sometimes we are on looking at things from a moralistic perspective and less than looking at it holistically, and that there's systems at play that push individuals to make a particular decision. Just like Comrade Zakiti was saying, I would rather buy a loaf of bread than go to a rally. It's that kind of decision. So that is not an indictment on me as an activist, but is much more of a question that we should be holistically having, that how do we support ourselves to eat and transform society the way we would like to transform it, and less of their comrades who are leaving the struggle and joining the other side. Thanks.
Thank you. I think that's a critical question for us all, right? It's like, what is this activism about? It can't be located in this sort of single space of, I oppose the issue, but I am also part of the system. And I think it's a grappling that we have to do all of the time in thinking about, I'm embedded in the system. I have to survive, but at the same time, my values call me to respond. And I think that's a really big question, maybe not for this conversation, but sometime we might want to pick it up. And I also think that there's something there about the distinction between the professional activist and the social justice leader, for want of a better word, the person who, from a sense of injustice, responds to the world, as opposed to the person who builds advocacy campaigns and their motivation and their location in the system. And that, for me, is a really big question for those of us working in the space need to grapple with. So thank you for that. I think that was a really, really useful little segue. Godfrey, sorry for making you wait so long, but over to you.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for the platform now, Alan. Yeah, I wanted also to actually share the existing challenges in terms of the activism with the circumstances happening here in Zimbabwe. As has been highlighted by my colleagues who have shared before, I think the greatest challenge that we are actually facing in Zimbabwe is the issues around the legislation. As we are actually seeing, they are trying to push and control activism in a way that it can actually capacitate them more, and they remain unaccountable. They will keep on pushing for individual benefits, and they want the system not to question why they are doing the certain things they are doing. And as it's been highlighted, this will actually keep on disenfranchising the communities, as we are going to be seeing that many people are going to be living in poverty. Human rights issues will keep on existing in the communities, and even the activists themselves will have no capacity, as they are afraid to be taken before the courts of law, being incarcerated, and leaving their families more vulnerable. And I think with these existing challenges, there is need for coordination amongst the activists, as well as push for self-regulation amongst organizations that do have activists, so that they can sort of capacitate activists to carry out their work, and also see that there is quite justice is given to activists who actually have a good cause for the community. You see the marginalized groups, you see the marginalized groups, like the groups that we work with, people with disabilities, those in prisons, orphans, widows. All these groups, they will remain marginalized as they usually rely on the activists for their cause. So that gap is going to keep on existing in Zimbabwe. So we are actually anticipating for more activism that will actually impact to raise the community voices. Working in unison will actually uplift the communities. Thank you so much, Alan.
Thank you so much, Godfrey. I think it's an interesting reflection that resistance always comes at the lowest point, right? It's like activism doesn't necessarily happen in a space that's open and free, right? No free and open society has ever had to rebel against the status quo, and in a strange way, possibly this closing of civil society space, or the closing of public space in all of our countries, is maybe the spark that sets off new resistance. And I find that contradiction quite interesting. And I think maybe Zagiti, it would be really interesting, your reflections on this in Swaziland, because you're facing a particular low point at the moment, and yet we've seen Swazis in the face of bullets every day almost, standing up and resisting. So what is this thing about resistance in the space of extreme authoritarianism? Is there something that we can leverage there? If we can also get Jeffrey the mic in the meanwhile, please. Zagiti, if you can maybe just talk about resistance under authoritarianism. And thank you as well.
Thank you, comrade. I think for us practically in Swaziland, the the thing that pushes the Swazis to resist is when you see no light, when you have no hope in the current system of governance. That is what pushes people to keep resisting, regardless of everything, regardless of the bullets, of the fires that are happening on daily basis, and the pain that is caused by the system, the arrest. When the government keeps on taking everything from the people, then that is what pushes people to resist. Because when you are in your comfort zone, everything is happening, you are getting everything, there is nothing much happening, then you tend to forget that you need to struggle for more. But when everything is shrinking, even the scholarships, there are no scholarship, we have all the reason to go out there and demand democracy, so that our rights are being taken care of. I think that is what causes Swazis to keep resisting regardless. For instance, the youth, when you have no job, you have nothing to lose. Even if you die, then you are bound to go to the street and resist on daily basis. That is why that keeps Swazis going regardless.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Kia, would you like to make an input before we go to Jeffrey? All good. So over to you, Jeffrey. Jeffrey, can you hear us? We can't hear you.
Yes, I can hear you. Am I loud and clear?
Yes, you are.
Thank you. I just want to share a brief scenario for Zambia. Indeed, the civic space in Zambia has also continued to shrink and close up. This is mainly on account of the Cyber Security and the Cyber Crime Act that was acted in 2021. We also have the Public Order Act of 1955. They have continued to impact the activism in Zambia, but also in the sector of the NGO, we are by the NGO Act of 2009. So these three make the civic space continue to shrink in the Zambian space. But however, there is a bit of room in that there is a legal reform that is taking place. And so many or all of these pieces of legislation are likely to be looked into. So maybe what we're looking forward to is a situation where that can this kind of work in terms of ensuring that more submissions are made during the time that the submission will be called for would be an interesting opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeffrey. So a call for Zambian-based activists to join this process of reforming the law. I thought we had another hand. I think Sikolile's hand is still up. So while we're getting Sikolile, there we go. Over to you.
Good morning, Alan, and good morning to the fellow colleagues and the panelists. It's such an interesting and insightful discussion that you are having. I wondered if even from the colleagues who have shared from Zimbabwe, Zambia, and Malawi, they could maybe indulge my question around the fact that with COVID, there were restrictions that came about, particularly in terms of people's assembly and gatherings. And I'm wondering, how did that affect the mobilization and the continuation of social justice work? And what has it taken them to actually bounce back and continue with the work, taking the demobilization that came with COVID? Yeah, that would be my interest. Thank you.
Thank you, Sikolile. Nogtula will come next. I just wanted to interject and reflect on something that was said earlier on about the idea that we don't resist when times are good. And I think that's a very important thing to remember, that we almost have to treat political activism or activism more generally in the same way that we treat food, that we have to shore up our political food in times when we have high, when there's a boom, when it's fertile, when there's space to talk, when there's space to grow our movements, that we should continue the work of political education, even though the world may look bright and rosy, because it can turn very, very quickly. And when it does turn, we need to be strong, and we need to have masses of people who are still organized, politically aware, and engaged with the systems so that we can mount resistance. And in many instances, maybe even prevent a slip into authoritarianism. And I think that there's something there to reflect on. And we might come back to is, how do we maintain our politics, our activism in times when it all looks good and rosy? Noctula, if we can get you the mic. There we go.
Hi, everyone.
We can hear you.
Yes, my name is Nigem Kize from South Africa in an organization called Kanambowoto, a women organization. We are in partnership with an NGO called AFRA, who is assisting us financially to go on with our struggle. So I just hear, I don't know if it's Kia or Zagiti talking about the things that happen in Swaziland, oppressive of a woman and killing or often excess. So I just wonder where it could be end for us, especially women, because we are so oppressed even now, even if we tried, but the system always brings us down. So it's all over, even in here in SA. It's not Zimbabwe, it's not Malawi, but if you are an activist, you always will be oppressed. And sometimes they use our poverty to bring us down, because they know that we don't have anything, and they're trying to bribe us with a position. Someone said that they bribe us in position in municipalities, in government, so that they can shut us down. Even in offices, we're facing the same thing, that they want to silence us as activists, not to talk. And it is way all over, and it's tiring now. It's time we have to do something. Someone said here, we have to work collectively. We have to collect brains. Maybe we need to do that in order to get the results. I thank you.
Thank you so much. So I think we're drifting into the space where we really would like to start talking about potential solutions, right? And I think Sikolile's question maybe is a good starting point for that. So what did we do to recover the space after COVID? All of the ground that was lost in terms of public gatherings, our ability to meet and talk. And I know, Zagiti, you guys had a particular experience around distance from the women's groups. So what are the potential strategies that we need to be thinking about to recover political space? And I'm talking about political space, not as in party politics, don't get me wrong, but the political space of activism and the fight for justice. Kia, you've been quiet for a while, so we'll start with you and then over to Zagiti.
Okay, I think I think we need to be, for me, and I've seen this quite a bit, but it hasn't been something that I've been directly involved in. And I think it's a remedy to start reclaiming political space, is to create space. So for example, even the conversation that we're having today, this is what we're doing. We're creating space. So this can even be, you know, for donors and NGOs who contribute to movement building support work, to create platforms and meetings and engagement moments where activists, comrades, and folks can just come together and be. I think 2 years of being locked in the spaces and even areas that continue to perpetuate and create the different forms of violences that we see and feel has meant that we've also been cut away from community. And a way to claim political space is to recreate these spaces. So maybe we have meetings and gatherings or dialogue or conferences where we just talking. And not talking for the sake of talking. I think we've been doing that for quite a bit now. I mean, talking for the sake of getting an opportunity to understand where Comrade Zakiti is at, where she gets an opportunity to understand where I am at, and what are we thinking about the current moment. Because I think, for me, the blessing that the pandemic has brought and what I've seen is that there's a lot more people who are starting to question the cracks that we've been seeing for a long time. So just also to answer, I guess, the question that you posed to the whole room, Ellen, around, you know, how do we keep our politics when things are rosy? I think this is the way in which we do it. We keep and maintain political consciousness and space by fighting to create moments to talk and engage with one another in means that brings out and creates moments for us to learn. So what I mean is that for us not to host a workshop and talk at people, but for us to host an engagement where we're talking with each other like this. Because there's a huge amount of appetite from folks to engage, and that's what I've seen. And maybe this is the time that we need to use to, I have a bad word for this, to capitalize on this opportunity.
Thank you, Kia. You've invoked the spirit into the meeting. Let's hope we can inject it quickly. Zagiti, so what opportunities did you guys see to rebuild after COVID? What were you doing that helped reconnect your communities?
For the Rural Women's Assembly, we have tried to use the media platforms, as everyone was going to do their meetings on Zoom. So we needed to do a quick shift also and engage our members through the media platforms. So it was very difficult because rural women have many challenges in terms of internet connection. Some areas are very difficult to connect with internet, and also the fact that some of them didn't go to school. It's difficult to use the gadgets. And for those who might have the gadgets, data is expensive, and also it might be difficult to operate it. So we set up a media team which consisted of regional secretaries and the national secretary, and also young women per region. So it was just a team of 10 people whom we banked on them when we had our meetings, who will log into Zoom and maybe have a few women around them gather together so that we are able to connect with them. But definitely it's not that easy as it was with physical meetings, because when you are dealing with 23,000 members and then you are having 10 media persons, then it becomes difficult. You cannot be able to reach out to all of them. But at least we had that connection with those few women during the COVID-19. But then I would like to concur with Comrade Kia to say we need the reflection. I like the Etubumbano space where you just reflect on what have happened, what should be done, because we keep going. Yeah, COVID is over, we are out, so you keep going without even reflecting and start afresh and build new strategies to go back to the communities and start rebuilding, regaining the membership that is already inactive.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I think that there's some really interesting strands that we'll explore as the conversation goes on. But we have Vanola on who's been making some comments in the chat, but has also got her hand up. If we can have the mic over. And Vanola, if you could also speak to this sort of this notion of recovering space as part of your input, please.
Thank you, Ellen, and good morning, everyone. Yes, as I say that as our political landscapes are becoming more repressive across the region, and our leaders are conspiring in using state capture as a tool to drive their own narrow political interests and selfish economic interests, which is not the interest of the electorate. We can expect more clampdowns, more arrests, more killings, more bullying, and across the range of mechanisms that we haven't experienced before. So I think we need to become very vigilant, and whereas finances as a resource is important, I think in this context, trust as a currency is going to be one of our most important social currencies. And if we can build trust through small groups of conversations like these, to have a closed sense of solidarity and comradeship, where people really trust each other. If I can tell you, I left my baby with the neighbors, can you just check in to make sure that she's safe, that the police is not coming, or the spies are not coming to attack my family? Can you make sure that you can give me access to data because I need to make an urgent phone call and I can't call from my own phone because I might be surveillanced. So we need to have a really safe space where people can have these conversations, because trust as a currency is fast being eroded, and it's also used to divide comrades sometimes, where there is divided interest, sometimes within an organization, within a movement, and within a political structure. So I think in that way, we need to have smaller spaces where we can rebuild this trust and then really feel safe to advance the common cause, because here we will say we need to embark on strategy A, B, and C. But when we go out there to implement the strategy, we'll fast see that, well, here is suddenly comrades that we never see in the meetings. They are very vocal. They are putting themselves up for leadership, but we haven't seen them before. Where can we go and say, how do we not, put all our cards on the table and say everything, and at the same time not becoming so mistrusting to the extent that our struggle is on a standstill. So I think rebuilding of trust as a currency is going to be important, and to invest in reflection of how that look like. We also need to invest in, for perhaps in an activist fund, where we can have, if I need to go to a meeting, or a comrade need to go to a meeting to discuss important safety and how do we advance a particular cause, how to protect something, or how to discuss the next action, We might need some transport money to take that comrade from point A to point B. We need some access to data. We need access to information, and we need to know who is holding what kind of information, where do we get certain information, because it is in lack of information and in our ignorance about specific topics and where a particular struggle is at, that our strategies may be wrongly informed. So access for information is going to be one of the angles that we need to use to expand and reopen our spaces that has become closed down. So, for example, I asked the question, who is activism for? And if we include young mothers there, if we include parents, then we are going to need to look at childcare. We're going to need to look at shelter. If a comrade is stuck in a certain place, what are the other comrades that are staying closer? Can you have a safe room there for the comrade to overnight while you're having this important meeting, and while it is unsafe for that comrade to travel back at night? And so these very practical things are going to take us forward, building the trust. So I'm also looking at us, looking at the practical activist fund, emergency fund almost, where we can tap in this, because there's always going to be the issue of, no, my NGO doesn't fund that. I don't have that in the budget, but we need this safety, how to safeguard our activists, because it seems that the activists who have sharpened their ideas, who have sharpened their skills, who have sharpened the strategies, and who have been putting forward as leaders are the ones targeted. And in the medium and long term, we also need to develop that second layer, which I could see from Ubambano at the last meeting in Johannesburg, bringing in young people, so that if we are targeted as the more veterans, older generation, middle-aged generation, then there are young people that can step in with the same access to information, with the same skills, so that we can keep the struggle alive and they don't get us where we don't want to be. And then also alternative livelihood strategies for activists, because they know if we cannot eat, if we cannot have water, if we don't have energy, then they really hit us hard as activists. And so for us to stay alive, we need to build alternative livelihood strategies in the long term. So when I spend my time in meetings and creating strategies, we need to make sure that the comrade has a livelihood, and our comrades are not on the street begging, while some of us in NGO spaces, where it's easier to get funds, are getting the salaries. And so that artificial divide among activists must also then be tackled. Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you, Vanola. Really useful contributions. There's some very practical things that are emerging out of both the conversations, and if you're not seeing it, in the chat boxes as well. So Zodwa made a comment about alternative livelihoods opportunities that's happening in Danhauser, where people have collectivized and built a food security system to prevent people, well, to help reduce the pressure to find jobs. This question of trust that Vanola has raised is critical, and sort of looking at it as a systemic issue. There's a comment from Tuli about the need for cybersecurity and protections, and that there are those organizations out there in the region in particular, who could assist with building those strategies and providing the tools for people. Again, a reflection on livelihoods. And then Vanola's made some points there that I think are very practical, that we'll draw into the report that comes out of this particular document. But please have a look at the chat. We have a question from Sturban, and I'm going to ask him to just please raise his hand and maybe articulate that question into the conversation. For those of you who can't see it, I'm going to ask him to speak. We have Simon, who's raised a hand, and he'll speak next. But in the meanwhile, Ashley, I think you'd like to make an input while we get Simon the mic.
Thanks, Ellen. I really enjoyed the last few minutes of the conversation because I think it's going towards a very practical response to some of the challenges that we face. I wanted to just raise one thing. The only other network more effective is the South African breweries who get beer to every corner of South Africa, and I imagine that will be the same in other parts of the region. But the only other network more effective or as effective in reaching the entire country, our communities, is the church. And nobody's spoken about the church as challenging them to become true to their prophetic calling, and that's to be a refuge for people. So I suppose I would add to the list of issues that we need to think about is how do we develop relationships with our churches and challenge our faith leaders to actually get out of from behind the altar and into the community that they're supposed to be serving. And then the other thing that I was thinking about is we can also, in addition to what people have been saying, we should learn from what our people have been using. In South Africa, they call it stokvel, and I'm sure that in other parts of the region, there's different community schemes where resources are mobilized or are mobilized collectively by people themselves. So it might be something that activists can think about as well in that space. Thanks.
Thank you, Ashley. That's really useful. And I assume you're not speaking about Christian churches only, you're talking about sort of multi-faith.
I am, yes, I am. But I know that the Christian churches in the Southern African region have got a lot of resources. They've got buildings, they've got infrastructure, they've got schools, and I think that those are things that should be used by the community. Yeah, but yes, interfaith, of course.
Thanks, Ashley. So we had given the mic, and then the person with the mic has disappeared. So maybe I'm going to move on to Stephen, and then if we can get the last person who wanted to speak back on again, please. Stephen, over to you.
Thank you so much, Alan. It's quite interesting to hear how much people have now come to realize the importance of activism. I've just been seeing also these things here in Zambia happening. Actually, we've seen being an activist, you are being given a platform to speak on certain issues, like all the other speakers have actually articulated. You hear we are lacking so much in terms of finances, in as much as you need to do the advocacy, you also need to have other strategies on how to actually keep yourself, how to take care of your family and other issues. Just some weeks ago, I was actually going somewhere to do my advocacy, and it was quite unfortunate that because the place where I was going to is a place where like transport is quite scarce, and the only people that usually go there is the same organization that I was following, which has been actually a harm to this community, and they're the only person who can provide the transport. So it was quite unfortunate that it couldn't be offered that transport. So it's quite unfortunate, and we've seen how advocates have been shrinking in some ways. But my question is, how and then do we sustainably, maintain and expand, this advocacy space in the midst of all these threats that we're actually encountering as activists? Thank you so much.
So maybe I can ask our two colleagues on the panel just to reflect on that a little bit. In the space of repression, how might we maintain spaces for activism?
I'll try to go first. I think Again, that's a very difficult question, and I don't think we can answer it all. But I was just thinking now while we're busy talking about some examples, even from the Black Lives Matter movement, which is they've really been focusing on not having a spokesperson, a particular person who's the face. There's many faces of that movement. So it would be interesting for us then to think about how do we maintain activism under violence and under the things that we're facing around not individualizing the struggle. My mother used to tell me about jokes on when communities used to take power and then the police would come and say, but who killed this person? And then the people would say, the community. You can't jail the whole community. I mean, if you want to, you could, but it's too much. So if we start thinking about how we don't individualize struggle, how we don't create the Beyoncés and the Kelly Rowlands of a particular movement, and they're the forefront of the movement, and they're the speakers of the movement, and that a movement and struggle and activism is collectivized and it's something that is done by the community for the community, then we can't isolate and inflict violence on a particular group of people or isolate and inflict violence on an individual. Because then the powers that be that are inflicting violence need to think twice about how and which way are they wanting to do it. Because comrades, we must be very honest around the fact that the shrinking space of dissent that we're seeing is because there's different groups and there's different otherings. So the powers that be know that there's a cluster of people who they can problematize and put on a pedestal as those who are the problem. And if we move away from creating the cluster of people who are the problem, and if everyone is the problem, then there is no one to inflict a specific kind of violence towards. It's the masses who are wanting to hold the powers that be accountable. And then the conversations need to be different then. These are just my 2 cents from the hip.
Thanks, Kia. Zagiti, anything to add?
Yeah, sure. I think what Kia is even saying is the thing of bottom-up approach, not to have this so-called leadership being the whole faces of the struggle, but each and every community member need to have the skill of activism, so that activism doesn't lie with the leaders, but everyone becomes an activist on his or her own space. So that is why we need to really do a good job in giving every community member the tools and capacity to act on their capacity in their own communities without waiting for someone to come and free people as if they are Jesus.
Thank you, Zagiti. So Simon is back. So I'm going to ask that Simon gets the mic. But also, Maxine, if you could raise your hand, please. I'm really interested in understanding the sort of how you're thinking about this alignment between a humanitarian organization and the work of activism. So just for you to share some of your ideas or your thought processes around that, please. That's Maxine Besaiden. I'll just put a comment in the box. Over to you, Simon. Simon, you're still muted. Can the moderator maybe unmute Simon manually if he's struggling? Okay. Can we pass over to Maxine in the meanwhile while we try and sort out the tech with Simon, please? There we go. Maxine?
Can you hear me?
Yes, yes, we can.
Yes. Thank you, Alan. I do feel like I was put on the spot a little bit, but I just had a thought that, you know, it would be interesting if there's so much evidence of, you know, how rapidly an organization like Gift of the Givers is able to respond in times of crisis. And I've been thinking a lot about sort of how that's possible, and you know, the ability to particularly mobilize large quantities of resources in a very short space of time. It's like magic to think, you know, when we see when I look at the kinds of things that they do, how it's possible. And I think it's important that we as activists and social justice activists particularly, are able to use some of those tools of network building. So when Ashley talks about engaging with faith-based organizations or institutions themselves, about you know, taking up their responsibilities towards social justice, and how we strengthen that relationship, and then also the idea of sort of you know, funds and that being sort of readily available. And I was thinking earlier, wouldn't it be possible that particularly NGOs and community-based organizations that receive grant funding make it a point to their funders that, you know, we'll take your money if you also contribute to this other fund that we have, you know, that in times of emergency, we are able to respond. So it's sort of part of your funding that you receive at these organizations. So, and I think it's also a mixture of what Kia was talking about earlier, and also I think Alan's point of sort of the stopfile idea, is that we sort of use the existing community networks that are known to be responsive in particular situations, but to be able to expand that responsiveness, I think would be important. Yeah, I'll leave it there. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Maxine. Simon, and then I'm going to try and start bringing us towards some conclusions. Simon? I'm really struggling with the tech with Simon. Okay. Simon, you need to accept the request to unmute, and then you can be given the space. So I'll keep an eye. As soon as Simon raises his hands again, we'll sort of bring him back into the conversation. But in the meanwhile, can I ask for overall reflections from Kia and Zagiti? Try to focus those comments on practical things. So from what you've heard, what are the things that are coming through for you that make sense that we should be exploring as a means to create the sort of safety network or the response network, as Maxine described? So just some of your reflections as we bring the conversation to a close. Who would like to go first?
Jesus Christ. Thank you, Comrade Ellen, mine will be what comrade, I think it's comrade Kolile who spoke of the oppression that women faces, which triggered the issue of cyberbullying for women activists and how social media is tracking down women activists online, which is also something that we need to look into as activists, because it is really bringing down images of women activists, because whenever it's a woman, the whole thing tends to sexual things. You are being labeled by all sorts of things related to sexual something. So that is how men or patriarchy takes women. So I think we need to dig deep in that and talk about it in our spaces, because it is really not okay. And also the issue of economic empowerment for activists, it is very key, because when you are hungry, you can do anything. You are unable to think, and that is why people end up selling the struggle, because you are hungry. It is only that conscious person who is able to resist, regardless of his or her stomach. So it is key for us to, even if we are struggling for better living, for better everything, but also we need to be surviving now. We need to eat now. So it is key that whenever we are going back to mobilize and organize communities, we also organize communities or activists for economical sustainability of, so that they are able to continue with the struggle without being disrupted by the system, which will come and offer them peanuts in the expense of the people. I think that is what triggered in the conversation while we were still discussing.
Thank you. Kia?
I think there's been, I think, a lot of concrete examples and ideas, and I've also been writing it down on my side, trying to think about them quite a bit. And I think for me, one of the overarching things is for us to remember that collective safety, protection, and dealing with violence and repression is context specific. So perhaps one of the concrete things for us to do and to think about in this region is to create moments and spaces for different activists who are based in different areas to think through what would be the best safety mechanism where they are based. And then I think another thing is for us to think about, for example, the responsive network. So for me, it's less of establishing a responsive network and thinking about how do we protect and maintain it. I mean, in South Africa, we had a group of, public interest law firms come together to start the Right to Protest platform. And recently, when you call the Right to Protest platform, the line is engaged. So I don't know necessarily what the challenges are. So it's for us to think about that, the things that we're establishing and starting, how do we protect and maintain them? And that then segues into these alternative ways of putting food on the table and securing sort of our own socioeconomic needs by, the networks around Stockfells and sort of pulling money together. I do think that the idea that Maxine posed in the room around, because we are within a donor funding landscape, and to be very honest, comrades, donors have portfolios and they need to disperse money. So if we as community activists, community-based organizations, or any formation are saying, well, we're in partnership with a particular donor, this is how the partnership should look like. And for us, this partnership means that you're not contributing to a programmatic or advocacy work, you're also contributing to maintaining and protecting the struggle that we're facing and waging. I think one of my last things is to go back to the point that I've been harping on quite a bit in relation to collective struggle. But this is around that I think we've all agreed in this room, and some of the ideas and suggestions that have been coming forth, that it does not make sense to remove the activists from the space of struggle. So then we need to think about how collective and individual protection looks like, and this needs to be contextualized. My last thing is around digital security and safety. This is something that we need to grapple with, and again, maybe link up with organizations that have already been doing these trainings and opening it up to activists directly on the ground and saying, hey, these are the things that are available. Would you like to engage in them, or would you like to get this training and see how it goes off? I did say my last point is my last point, but I promise this is my very last point. The idea that Comrade Vanolia had around a fund, I think it's an important idea, and it's something that we should pursue in our different corners, even as a loose network here of people engaging in conversation, because there are some funders who started some funds, like there's the Environmental Justice Fund that's recently been started. So we could look at maybe collaborating with socioeconomic justice organizations and public interest law firms and pulling a fund of this nature that exists to support activism at its sort of basic levels. That's just my 2 cents. Thanks.
Okay, so I'm gonna try to bring us to a close. There are about 4 or 5 things that have stood out for me in this conversation. I also want to leave some time for Ashley just to make some closing comments. 4 or 5 things that have stood out, and sort of 1 or 2 sort of almost principle reminders that we have to hold for ourselves. The basis of the work is to build human connection and trust, that we have to focused on the trust building part of the work as a primary way of rebuilding our movements, of rebuilding our activism. But it's not a once-off thing. That trust, when built, has to be maintained. And that maintenance is through contact, through working together, to learning about each other and growing our relationships. And often this will also break. And so there's another cycle of rebuilding that will always emerge in these processes. So critical, remember that it's based on human connection, and that trust is the foundation, and that trust is a commodity. It has to be worked with. It has to be built, strengthened, rebuilt constantly. It's never not going to be in the portfolio of things that we do. The second thing is to create spaces for people to connect and reconnect. And that's in a community level, at a regional level, at a national level, at multiple levels. Spaces for people to come together, not just to find solutions often, but also to find solidarity, care, support, to share ideas, to talk about their struggles, and to help people maintain that humanity that our activism is centered around. And an interesting piece from Ashley's input is to say, well, there are physical resources that we can tap on in our communities and here as well. The halls are there, the sports fields are there, the parks are there. We have the churches, we have other institutions that have infrastructure that can allow us to create those safe spaces, physically safe spaces, for us to meet and talk and build up a collective politic that then will potentially help us elevate our struggles. A very practical example or a very practical recommendation around an activist fund. And as Kia said, there's some initiatives around that in the more formal NGO space, but I don't think that there's anything that's particularly flexible, adaptive, and quick enough for the kind of support that would be needed. As Vanola said, sometimes it's about transport money to get somebody to a meeting. Sometimes it's about paying for childcare so that women can attend a meeting. or a variety of other things that don't necessarily fall within the current way that donors are thinking about funding. And so an activist fund would need to be radical. It would need to shift the status quo and be embedded in the politics that we all carry, which is around centering people and around the notion that the environment we live in is unpredictable, and that we need to be more in tune with that unpredictability and give us the flexibility to respond. Kia's point around the fund is a critical one. We've seen numbers of projects to create movements, numbers of projects to draw people together. But for many of those projects, we have not looked at the sort of maintenance, rebuilding, the foundational pieces that we talked about in the trust conversation. That structures, organizations, collectives need work to sustain it. It's not simply a matter of setting them up and thinking that they will last into perpetuity. So there's work to be done there. There's human work, there's relational work, there's work that is required to keep a body like that or a structure like that in tune with what is happening in the world around it. Another critical one is this notion of don't look to the savior, that Jesus is not coming tomorrow, that we have to rely on ourselves as a collective, that we have to build leadership, we have to diversify leadership, and we need to disperse leadership amongst our movements and organizations. The organization is always weak when it has one particular focal point, that if the state or any other actors eliminate that person, then the movement collapses around them. And while we've known that for many, many years, many of our movements still mimic a structure that places power at an apex and in the control of one single individual. And the words that Zagiti used earlier on around bottom-up organizing, bottom-up constructions of our organizations are something that we need to really, really grapple with. How do we build a properly democratic and diversified movement that is able to continue to function with or without the grand leader? And then some reflections on the need for us to start thinking about digital protections, not just at the NGO level, but also at the community level. Monitoring is becoming an important thing. As Agiti described, the violence that's been perpetuated against women on online platforms, in places that we might take for granted, in ways that for a lot of people in the sector might feel quite innocuous. But the sexualization of women, the denigration of women, the attacks of women on these social media platforms are things that we have to pay more attention to. And it's not something that we have to develop ourselves, because there are numbers of organizations in the region who are doing this kind of work. And we need to collaborate with them more and try to get the tools and protections out to the broad mass of people, not just to the grand leaders. And I think there's two sort of principal issues with some practical solutions, I suppose, that came out. One is that we have to remember that people have to eat, that no matter what the basis for our activism is, we're always vulnerable to economic pressures. Decisions about how we spend the small amounts of money that we have are critical as to whether we can maintain our activism or not, whether we can go to the meeting, whether we need to stay at home and provide childcare. There's a whole range of things that we need to consider. And there's been some interesting suggestions about how we might approach the livelihoods question, and how we might also approach providing some kind of economic safety net for activists engaged in struggle. The difficulty there always is that, again, those funds, those things tend to focus on the famous, on the ones who stand at the head of struggle, and not necessarily bring protection or defense to the broader mass of people behind them. And that can often lead to contestation, unhappiness, and the breakdown of movements and activism. And so it's something that has to be carefully thought through. How do we build an economic safety net that is pervasive and supports the large body of people. I think here places a particular challenge on the table when she says, but we exist within the system that we are trying to dismantle. So how do our livelihood strategies, or the livelihood strategies that we consider, also act as a point of activism, as a point of creating and demonstrating that alternatives are possible, that are not grounded in capital, that are not grounded in the notion of the grand leader or the hierarchy, or the strongest will survive, which seems to be a lot of what we talk about nowadays. We were reminded that context is important, that it is not always the right thing to remove an activist from the site of struggle, that their struggle is located in a place and they need to find safety and security in that space, and that we have to locate the broad notion of change and activism in people's local struggles. We have to be able to shift and change things in community, not just at the macro level, not just laws and policies, not just the attitudes of the power holders, but in the attitudes in our communities themselves. There are probably quite a few other things that I'll probably pick up when I listen to the transcript, but for now, those are the takeaways for me, and the few more that we'll collect from the various bits and pieces that we have, the chats, the questions, and any other inputs that anybody would like to make. Please feel free to mail it through to us. Before I hand to Ashley, I'm going to ask Kia and Zagiti just to make any final reflections, and then we will ask Ashley to close the morning for us. Zagiti? Kia?
Let me say this. I have no closing remarks or reflections. I think your connecting the dots was there was a cherry on top. So I was even thinking about things when you were saying stuff. So just wanted to say thank you for this opportunity to engage in this way, and for all of the comrades who were sharing their thoughts and opinions. It also helps me as an activist think about these things going further. And I hope that we'll be able to continue to engage like this, because this is one of many conversations that need to lead us to the alternatives that we're talking about. Thanks.
Yeah. Zagiti?
Thank you so much, comrades, and the comrades who are in this space also. My encouragement will be to say, let's just root all the points that we have already connected into one sole thing, which is solidarity amongst all of us in the region as activists, because there is power in solidarity, as we've already mentioned about it. Thank you so much. Have a great day ahead.
Thank you. And then back to you, Ashley, to bookend our conversation.
Very good. Thank you, Ellen. I think it's been a great conversation. I think it's how we approach things as Active Bumbano is we listen to the lived experience of people and we try and gain wisdom and insight from that, rather than from trying to rely on people who've got PhDs and things or money. So I think all of you have been incredible. I think our panelists have been amazing. I think the participants, we had at one point 39, almost 40 people online. We've kind of eroded now as we get to the end. I think those other 60 that registered but didn't pitch up, I'm going to have to write them a very stern note. But look, I think this has been a great conversation. And thank you, Ellen, for summarizing that. I hope it informs how we do our work when we go forward. And certainly Active Bumbano will be around to support and to try and convene those spaces so that we carry on having these conversations. Thank you very much, Ellen, for great facilitation. And I hope we see everybody again soon. Have a good weekend when it starts tomorrow.
Thank you. Thank you, Ashley. Thank you, comrades, for participating in this. It's been a great 2 hours. We look forward to many more.
Thank you, everybody. Bye.